on behalf of Sustainable Macleod, I want to welcome you to the Gardens for Wildlife talk. First, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung as the traditional custodians of the land that this is coming from, and pay my respects to their elders, all their elders. And just a brief word about Sustainable Macleod before I introduce our speaker, Kate Jost. For those of you who aren't members, Sustainable Macleod is a local organisation whose aims are to support a more sustainable community through food security, clean energy use, and so forth. Membership only costs $30 a year, and there's a lot of benefits for that. Kate Jost, our speaker, is the president of the Friends of Edwards Lake. She's the volunteer lead for Darebin's Garden for Wildlife program, a wildlife rescuer, and Darebin Citizen of the Year for 2024. So here she is.
Thank you, Priya, for the very kind introduction. As Priya says, I am all of those things. I also work in the natural resource management space with one of the government agencies, Melbourne Water. I'm their senior safety advisor for waterways and catchments. So I work with people who work along our creek lines and in our natural spaces. Very passionate about wildlife and biodiversity, which hopefully makes me slightly qualified to give this presentation, but we'll see how we go. I'm just going to share my screen. Can we all see that?
Yep.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Gardens for Wildlife program, specifically the Banyule Gardens for Wildlife program, and what it's about, as well as how you can participate on it. Now, we're going to go on a bit of a journey down, and we're going to talk about some of the risks to wildlife, but then we'll finish on a high where we'll talk about actions that can be taken to support wildlife in your gardens. So what is the Gardens for Wildlife program? The Gardens for Wildlife program started in 2017-2018 with the Knox City Council and the Knox Environment Group. They decided that there was a need to form an association where they could communicate and advocate for people's private land, your gardens, to become refuges for wildlife. Since that time, where it was just Knox City Council who had signed up to that. Sorry, my internet just told me that it was unstable and I had a moment of panic. There has been a lot of groups that have, other councils that have joined, including Banyule. It's also a really good news for Banyule because the neighbouring councils are also board with Darebin, which is where I'm the lead of. Marybeck has just signed on. We've got Nillumbik and various other things. Some other councils, while they haven't signed up to the Gardens for Wildlife program, they do have their own version of advocacy for Indigenous planting. But this feels like a really lovely little community. I don't know whether you've seen some of these stickers on your neighbours' letterboxes and things like that, but it's certainly something to look out for. So it's a co-design and a collaboration. As Priya mentioned at the start, I'm the volunteer garden guide lead. So I work directly with council as it is co-led. Some programs are set up slightly different. If we've got any garden guide in the room and you're thinking, hey, that's not how Banyule is set up, or perhaps another council, there is opportunities for it to be set up in different ways, and this is the way that Darebin has gone about it. So that co-design and collaboration happens with council signing on to the program and deciding that they want to be affiliated with the program. It then involves a recruitment process of local volunteer garden guides and also the collaboration with the local Indigenous nurseries. We've got the lovely Steph there, who is up at Namjak Tamboran, that was at La Trobe University. And a little bit of a fun fact for those of you who may or may not know, Namjak Tamboran actually means in Wadawurrung, respect the waterway, which is a little bit of a theme in this presentation. So it's lovely Steph planting the plants. The Gardens for Wildlife program is important for a number of reasons, and this is where we're going to go on the downward journey, and then we're going to come back up with a whole lot of hope and a whole lot of action. So the goals of the program are very much to connect private gardens and land to support wildlife by the creation of habitat within those spaces. It's to increase the habitat connectivity. We've got a lovely creek just there. There are creeks all over Victoria, as I'm sure that you're very aware. And with our houses, it makes it very difficult for particular species of wildlife to travel. So having these nice little places of refuge or these nice little paths, being Indigenous and native gardens, it makes it easier for wildlife to travel. And wildlife travels for all sorts of reasons. So having a nice stepping stone is nicer and easier and safer than peril. It's also about building the skills and confidence of those in their gardens to care for land and wildlife, to care for country. It's also about creating community connections, much like this group here. I'm sure that many of you didn't know each other before you all decided or discovered that you had a common knowledge in wanting to having a more sustainable Macleod. There's also a lot of research around the health and well-being benefits for humans who care and experience nature. Nature brings a lot of healing and a lot of joy to us. I'm sure that we all have our own personal stories of a species of wildlife that we saw, or a flower opening, or a tree growing, or perhaps you planted a tree in a local reserve or along a creek and you've been watching it grow up for the last few decades. All of that has very strong connections to health and well-being. So what really does is it connects all of these open spaces, and in particular waterways. Waterways are sacred in most Indigenous cultures. They are life bringers. They are considered life veins by some First Nations people across the world. In Australia, we're a little bit protection. There are protection on creeks like Darebin and Merry Creek. The others are still on the journey of that, but they are the meeting place of not only humans but other species. They are places where wildlife seeks refuge, where they get water, where they're able to travel, and we need to create connections between all of these bodies of water in order for wildlife to thrive. So some threats to biodiversity that may be applicable across Macleod or in your own gardens that we'll talk about. Urban development and habitat fragmentation is a really big one. There is a very strong reason why we don't have a lot of ground-dwelling mammals such as the kangaroo or wombat or various different small rodents, because we've built roads and things in between all of this habitat, and it makes it very difficult for them to travel. Unfortunately, in the local area, there have been a lot of cases where wildlife have been injured while travelling between different habitats or trying to find home, particularly with larger mammals that eat vast quantities of grasses, being kangaroos and wombats and things like that, and that don't have the ability to either fly or to travel via tree, which sounds like a strange statement, but things like possums and gliders have the ability to hop through the canopy if it's available. It's also can be a real problem for birds, particularly with their young. This is a photo just here of some really lovely Australian wood ducks. They're sometimes called Maine ducks. We've got Dad in the front who has a lovely dark head with a bit of a mohawk on the back, and Mum at the back with her very speckled front plumage. And they have very large families. And unfortunately, this family of wood ducks needed to cross the road with their young who couldn't fly, and it ended in them perishing. So it's a real problem for wildlife, but hopefully the Gardens for Wildlife program can help. Weeds, another big one. There's some interesting ones on here. The Invasive Species Council has just conducted a study that believes that has shown that 75% of all environmental weeds are garden escapes, which have been purchased, the majority of which have been purchased through nurseries. So we've got some real culprits here. So I'm sure you've all seen this one here that's popping up everywhere. It's called all sorts of things, and there's various different species: fountain grass, foxtail grass, various other things. They believe it'll be the next environmental weed of significance. It's being favoured by landscape planters. A lot of people think that it is a native grass. It is not. And if you would like proof of how invasive it is, you can drive past the McDonald's on Plenty Road near the La Trobe campus, where it is growing in the cracks of the concrete outside of the dentist. It is a very interesting weed. Then we've also got some regular culprits. Prickly pear, tiger pear is another one that has a slightly different frong and more dangerous prickles on it. Blackberry is another one. There's a lovely, charming account in the Museum of Hobart where a young Englishman writes to his family about his failures in getting his blackberry to grow, and he hopes that he will have more success next year. If only we could get a time machine and ask him to stop, because he was very successful. Unfortunately, willows, agapanthus, Chilean needlegrass, which is also very hard to distinguish between, identify between some of our native grasses unless it's in seed. Very invasive. The classic, often referred to as the council weed, dietes, that have thousands of, once that flower dies, it has thousands of seeds in its seed pod, which then disperse and get out into the environment. There's also a bit of misconception about native versus Indigenous, and it's a question that I often get. I want a native garden. I want to plant native plants. And that in itself is not an incorrect statement. But I think that we're still very much on the learning journey of Indigenous plants. Native, and I'm sure that a lot of you in this room know, native refers to something that is native to a particular country. Now, this may be true of something like this. This is called sweet botostrum. It's a rainforest plant. It is indeed native to Australia. Outside of its rainforest environment, it acts like a weed. Rainforest plants are very competitive with each other. They're competing for the canopy. There's lots of moisture. Things grow really fast. So these plants have all sorts of tricks that they play on each other to reach the canopy and outcompete their competitors. This plant's particular trick is it has a chemical in its leaf, which when it drops its leaves on the ground, it releases this chemical into the soil and it prevents anything from growing around it. It's very clever. In a grassy open woodland, which is what Macleod is, as well as Banyule, it will smother out our plants. There are places across Victoria that are not rainforest environments, because that doesn't happen until we get to the New South Wales border, where there are teams of people cutting back infestations of sweet pittosporum because it is killing pre-colonial eucalyptus trees. It's mainly spread by fruit-eating birds that have instincts to create larders. So blackbirds, they take the fruit. Their instinct is to plant a larder to survive the cold, harsh winter so they don't starve. They then go around an existing tree. They bury the fruit, and then winter's not that bad in Australia. So they think to themselves, oh, I don't have to go and find all that fruit that I buried. The tree grows around the surrounding tree, and if it's not controlled, it dies. There's then a whole lot of misconception about some plants that are considered native, but they're not. This is always my favourite, the national flower of South Africa. I can remember as a young child being on holiday with my parents thinking, oh, look at all these purple trees. We're so lucky to have these beautiful trees in Australia across New South Wales and Queensland, you know, beautiful flush of purple. Purple was my favourite colour when I was a kid. They must be from Australia. This is such an Australian thing. South American plant. We also have a situation where the commercial nursery industry has genetically modified a whole lot of plants. Now, in some cases, that isn't going to cause too much problem. In other cases, it will cause a lot of problems. Coria is a really great example of that. So Coria is a plant that is very prone to hybridization. So these types of designed plants, whether it's a particular color or a particular size or a particular shape or of the leaves, or it has a longer flowering season to suit our aesthetic desires, can often cause problem with the reproduction of the indigenous plant. Furthermore, with this genetic modification or hybridization of the plants and the tinkering with them, I suppose you'd call, it can also lead to other problems. So longer flowering season normally means that animals get more aggressive with each other to compete for that valuable food source of a never-ending native plant. It also, generally, these plants, if they're from a commercial industry, they don't reproduce because that would be a very bad commercial business plan if you sold a product that was going to continuously reproduce. So if you are an animal that relies on a plant reproducing and producing a seed, if you're something like a crested pigeon or a finch, that's not great news for you, because it means that you're not going to have a food source. Litter is another big issue as well, which may be present in our gardens or around our homes, certainly in our open spaces. These are some really unfortunate photos of some local wildlife. Fishing-related litter normally gets swans because of the way that they feed. They tip themselves upside down in the water and they eat submerged vegetation. Things like eelgrass is a common name. And when litter that tends to draw to the bottom, like sinkers and hooks and things like that, it gets stuck. We've also got a little pied cormorant here, which is very much a resident of our local waterways, entangled in a milk bottle top. We've also got a corella just here who has their head stuck in a Slurpee like smoothie container. And these photos have all been taken across Victoria, so it's very much a local issue. Light pollution is another thing that is quite detrimental to nocturnal wildlife, which are all of these spectacular creatures here. Some are more adaptable than others, but there is a story of this lovely little individual here who is sitting on the hand of one of the keepers at Hillsville Sanctuary. This is a mountain pygmy possum, and it eats bogon moths. So the mountain pygmy possum lives up in the Blue Mountains and relies on this lovely bogon moth migrating across Victoria and heading to the Blue Mountains as a food source. We all know the saying, a moth to the flame. Unfortunately, with light pollution, these moths are coming off their course. They're not going on their journey up to the Blue Mountain, and these poor wee little possums are at risk of starving. So there's currently a whole lot of dedicated volunteers who are feeding them bogon moth biscuits, where these moths are being turned into biscuits and scattered throughout the Blue Mountains, but it's not sustainable. So lighting is a real concern, and it is an easy fix in my opinion, because things like red and green light cannot be seen by nocturnal animals. And if we had a need to have lights outside, we could simply change the color of them and ensure that they're pointing down, various other things that would give these nocturnal animals a break. And I know there's a whole lot of connotation towards the red lights. Thank you so much, Amsterdam, but could potentially turn them green or just look at it in a different perspective. Chemicals, poisons are another huge concern as well. If you're wanting butterflies in your garden, but you're also spraying insecticides, it's probably not going to work out the way that you desire. These types of chemicals are rarely targeted at a specific species. They're normally a generalist poison that will target all invertebrates. There's a dramatic, many scientists are reporting dramatic declines of invertebrates or insects across the world, and it's very much linked to chemicals and loss of habitat. We've also got some other common household pest control chemicals there. So rat sack or rat bait, which has rodenticide in it, which is essentially a blood thinning agent that causes the animal to breathe to death. Unfortunately, it is responsible for a lot of secondary poisoning in owls, tawny frogmouths, and there has been some recent research to say that possums are also affected by this, in particular brush-tailed possums. I don't know if anyone's ever met a brush-tailed possum, but they will generally eat anything that they can put in their mouth, in my experience, which also includes small mammals. We've also got snail bait as well. There are some eco-wildlife friendly snail bait. I'm yet to see research that would deter me. Snail bait is needed in even Indigenous nurseries, but those areas are closed off where creatures can't get to them. It's also quite, particularly these two chemicals down the bottom, really detrimental to any pets that we have in the house as well, cats and dogs in particular. Also, if anyone has any pet reptiles like blue tongues, that would be not a good day for them. We also have a huge issue with pest animals, and we have a lot of them. Australia has a very interesting history with the introduction of pest species. We have the fox introduced for hunting and nostalgia from the British, as well as the blackbird, who is some people think is quite a sweet bird, and they do have a lovely song, but they are terrible at spreading, in particular that sweet botostrum, blackberry, all things that are probably quite nostalgic and instinctual to them, being all those European weeds. We've also got the various different rats, both black and brown, which cause all sorts of issues with our native rodents, to the point where we only have them in very select places now. And they predate on bird eggs and various other things. Bit of a bugger. And then we also don't like them, so then we poison them. So, huge problem. We've got the European wasp here. I'm not sure its introduction story, something to research, but a real, not only an unpleasant insect, because we get stung and they're quite aggressive, but also they predate on our native pollinators, particularly caterpillars, and do it quite aggressively. We also have the common myna, previously known as the Indian myna, but that has been reclassified as the common myna, as it was found in parts of Europe, that was introduced in the 1870s to control caterpillars from market gardens. They were so successful that they decided to introduce them into New Zealand about a decade later, who also have similar problems to us, with them not only being quite good at getting rid of caterpillars out of the garden, they also are quite aggressive. You've probably noticed some of their behaviour in displacing native birds. The reason why these types of pest animals as well are quite detrimental is, one thing we need to remember about Australia is when we had Gunawada and Australia broke away and floated across the ocean, that happened 65 million years ago. And our native wildlife has really grown up and evolved without these types of predators and pests. So it's really quite problematic. So the birds that we have that eat insects, teeny tiny little birds, generally, between 20 and 40 grams, generally solitary, various other things. So when you introduce a bird like this into the ecosystem that lives in very big social groups, they can decimate an insect population in no time, which is why I'm sure the market gardeners back in the 1870s thought they were amazing, because they were saving all of their crops. I also want to talk about some issues around our beloved pets. And I know that we have some pets in the room, so I come from a very loving place. I also have a cat on my feet, but we do need to acknowledge that dogs and cats can sometimes be quite frightening to wildlife, and in some cases cause serious injury and also fatalities. So while many people might think that this is a very amazing photo, and I will credit that, the dog midair and it's very crisp, chasing some wood ducks, I want to give a size comparison. Imagine something that is the size of a bear to us chasing you. Very scary. Stress, fearing for your life, all of things which are not particularly good for your health is happening. We also have a whole lot of breeds of dogs that are incredibly popular, where their instinct is they have been bred to chase birds. They have been bred with blunt teeth. They're hunting dogs. That's their group. So I don't want to villainize any of these creatures, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge their natural instincts and also have that responsible pet ownership. We move on to cats. Cats are a huge issue. I have an indoor cat. She's very happy. The most thing that she predates on is the curtains, and she does that very well. Luna is the third cat I've had in my life, all indoor. mainly because I want to keep them safe as well as be a responsible owner and protect wildlife. Um, Her ability to hear a bird that is foraging around in my garden, not calling, but just foraging around when my curtains are closed and the roller shutter is down, and when I open it, it reveals a bird, picking around for a worm or something like that, is terrifying. They are incredible hunters, and many documentaries on wild species of cats that are just their hunting skills is second to none. Unfortunately, that is a cat with a golden whistler in their mouth, which is a really lovely little bird. Um, there it is, just there, the male golden whistler. So, the Invasive Species Council commissioned a study. This is a few years old now. Lots of people, when I talk about cats, say, "Well, what about foxes? They're terrible." I think you can see from the stats there, cats kill, including domestic cats, kill 4 times the amount of reptiles each year, 2 times the amount of birds, and double the amount of mammals. There has been no studies conducted on frogs or insects. Anecdotally, I can tell you that frogs, particularly cats that go in and visit wetlands and creek areas, are also victim of this. Again, not to villainize them. I have a cat. I love her dearly. I give her 50% of my bed each night. But we also need to acknowledge that they have a severe effect on our wildlife. And most of our wildlife is very cute and very fluffy and unable to, and inequipped to deal with a predator of this type. They did not evolve with them. We do not have in our various different wildlife species, we have nothing that is cat-shaped. In other countries of the world, the Americas, Europe, various other things, Asia, Africa, they have cat-shaped predators. So their biodiversity and their wildlife has evolved with them and has some skill set to deal with them. Our wildlife doesn't. You're feeling a bit depressed, maybe. There is time to turn it around. I want to give you the hope and go upon that upward journey and give you some key actions of what can be done to help you create sanctuary, which I think is such a lovely word, sanctuary for wildlife in your gardens. So we're in Macleod. There are a whole lot of species that are really threatened and should be in this space, but aren't. And once upon a time, there would have been things like plains wanderers. We've got a few growling grass frogs, but not a lot. There would have been a marsupial type of predator, a spot-tailed quoll. There would have been things like legless lizards, golden sun moths, a little bit of Cyanella amina, which is this lovely little plant just here. There would have been things like swamp everlastings, which there's a whole lot of projects to regenerate that, and it's certainly something you can plant in your garden. We have a few visitors every now and then of the swift parrot, which Taylor Swift has certainly helped the campaign to help them by taking on by people being quite clever with that puns and memes that they make on the internet. We've also got some really large birds that are no longer present here. So this is a red-tailed black cockatoo with the female and the male that need really large hollows. And with the loss of some of our large hollow-dwelling trees that were cleared for, our houses and roads and things like that, really difficult. A bird of size, quite a big bird, I think about 70 centimeters. For a hollow to develop for their needs, it takes about 300 years. So that's a really long time for a hollow to develop. They're also not, they're a bit fussy, and rightfully so. They get to choose where they live. They're a bit fussy with nesting boxes and things like that. So really difficult, really important to protect our old growth trees and definitely our pre-colonial trees. So we do have some urban biodiversity that at this current moment in time is seems stable, but I think we at some point are at if we don't take action, that we may lose at some point. You know, the brush-tailed possum, another hollow dwelling species, another species that is quite large. Their average weight is about 4.5 kilos, so the size of a cat. So a hollow to develop in a tree, again, hundreds of years. We've also got the lovely grey-headed flying fox, or fruit bats as they're commonly known, who are really susceptible to climate change. I don't know if any of you remember a few years ago when we were in a drier season, which we are currently coming into a hotter season, where Parks Victoria had to install sprinkler systems to keep them cool. They're also a keystone species. They're really important for seed dispersal individuals and pollinators that are responsible for most of the eucalyptus on the eastern seaboard, particularly the species that koalas eat. So without these lovely creatures that do eat all of the fruit off our fruit trees and only take one bite out of each piece of fruit, we wouldn't have a lot of other species. Various other lovely creatures here that are sometimes common, that are returning, and are sometimes in trouble. Golden orb spiders, you know, the lovely tawny frogmouth, Kreft's gliders, previously sugar gliders, again, that are all susceptible to the threats that we spoke about earlier. So they need as much help as the animals in the previous slide. When we start thinking about the needs of wildlife, it is not much different to our own. They need clean air to glide in and breathe. They need water, as we do. They need shelter and a place to sleep, and that is going to come in all sorts of forms, whether it be a hollow or a nest that they build, or in this particular example, this is a bachelor group of a whole lot of blue-banded bees that need native grass to sleep on. That's their shelter. They also need food, and while it may be tempting to feed wildlife, we are not experts in their diet, unless you are a wildlife carer. And wildlife carers are mainly feeding wildlife that are in some sort of rehab or recovery, native vegetation, or if they eat insects or meat, if they're something like an eagle or a tawny frogmouth or a quoll, they're feeding them native sources or very lean meat. So we definitely don't need to feed them. We definitely need to plant for them. It's a lovely little brush-tailed possum eating some hoop gardenia. They also need to feel safe enough to reproduce. And once they have all of these foundations of their foundational needs, you will normally get them feeling safe enough to reproduce. So how do you do this in your garden? Wildlife, generally from vegetation or plants and from our gardens, need two things. Now, not everything is going to be achievable in everybody's garden, but I'll go through it regardless because you're all going to have different gardens, and I pass this information on. So structural and species diversity is the main important one. We've got a canopy layer, which is where there'll be hollows and perches, and Indigenous plants across Banyule and in the local area, those plants that are going to be part of that canopy are going to be things like eucalyptus, whether that be the various different species, ironbark, red box, yellow box, not achievable in everyone's garden, particularly things like ironbarks that are 40 meters. If you have a great garden that's of size, I would definitely advocate for that. We start moving into some of the smaller trees, banksias, yeah, acacias or wattles, still fantastic choices to create that canopy layer. We then move into the shrub layer, which is generally where you're going to find smaller birds. Smaller birds have a really hard time. There's not a lot of shrub layer across a lot of open spaces. It's getting better with councils learning about the need of this, but we've still got a long way to go. That shrub layer is going to consist of various different things. It's going to consist of all your small to medium shrubs. It's also a place where things like vines are going to grow, like this clematis. I would very much advocate for some of this shrub layer to be spiky. So here we've got rosemary grevillea, we've got sweet Bassaria, we've got hairpin banksia, I think is its common name, or Banksia Cunningham, that have a bit of spike to them. Smaller birds really need that in order to feel safe, particularly when they're being predated on some big bully bird, like well, not so big, but noisy miners are a bit of a bugger. And that's because they're confused. They live in the edge of forests, so they like a big tall tree and then a whole lot of grasses underneath, which is exactly what we have created in park environments. Big, large trees, mown grass. So the noisy everything. Planting this shrub layer and including some spiky things, we start to even the balance. Your last layer is going to be a ground layer. That's going to be things like your grasses, your some of the smaller plants are called herbs, wildflowers, logs, and rocks. And there is a beautiful selection of these plants. Sticky everlastings, cutleaf daisy or brackiscombe, the various different ground cover salt bushes, running postman, various other things, grasses, lilies, beautiful, beautiful plants. You'll also notice that there's a particular palette to these plants. The majority of the flowering plants either come in 3 colors. 2 of them is the yellow and the purples, as you can see here. There is a reason for that. Daytime pollinators see in ultraviolet. It speaks to them that those colors pop and they are drawn to them. Nighttime pollinators like moths are drawn to white flowers. A light source will reflect off those white flowers and reflect, and the moth will know to come, and other nighttime pollinators will know to come down because there's a food source there. So, how do we apply this in all types of situations? Here is a very average, ungreen looking apartment block that I'm sure is a very nice place to live. And there's not a lot of, I'm sure that vacuuming and various other things doesn't take a hell of a long time. It would definitely be my preference. But how do we make this suitable for wildlife? It does look like a bit of a challenge. No one's got any soil on their balconies. There's very limited opportunity on the street, various other things. A lot of these wildflowers and grasses can be planted in pots, which can be put on balconies, creating haven for pollinators and various other things. There are a lot of smaller species, things like kangaroo grass, Camilla sunray, magenta stalksbill, this is milk beauty head, that can all be planted into pots with lots of diversity, offering these types of invertebrates a place of refuge, a place of food as they travel across the human world. If you are successful enough with the plantings, you may end up seeing things like butterflies and wee little marble geckos and native bees on your balcony. Many people who have done this in very urban areas, particularly in the city of Melbourne, very dense, lots of apartments are seeing some of these species that are traveling from open spaces like Royal Park into people's homes. This is actually a little jumping spider that used to live in my car. So, you know, anywhere can be habitat. You also may consider putting in things like bee hotels. They're not incredibly sophisticated to make. Natural materials put into things like a can or an old mug or something like that, positioned in a sunny space, can give all sorts of little insects a place to nest. You may even consider putting in a saltbush, which is a great food source for things like marble geckos. You can also eat them yourselves. They're very tart, but some people love them. You may also with a visitor like an insectivore bird. So this is a little white-plumed honeyeater. I specifically chose this apartment block, which is near a local Woolworths, that has a whole lot of flowering eucalyptus in the car park, where there is a large flock of white-plumed honeyeaters that actually live in the Woolworths car park. So people in the neighbouring apartment blocks, like this one that is across the road, would really enhance this little bird's life by planting all of these various different things, giving it some alternative food sources. We then have another example of a home that has an opportunity for improvement, in my opinion. We could plant a canopy tree here and replace the, I think it's a crepe myrtle, happy to be corrected, to provide habitat. Acacias are a wonderful plant and they really need us to advocate for them. When studies have been conducted, there is more invertebrates on an acacia than any other plant. Again, we could start putting in that shrub layer of diverse plants so they're flowering at different times, offering a food source for those that eat pollen at various different times of the year. We could then put in some of those prickly plants to support the smaller birds. We then start putting in the ground story. We start putting in things like Dianella for local bees, sticky everlastings for butterflies, and some of the grasses. Insects need two things. They need a food source, being the flowers, and they also need a place to sleep and roost and lay their eggs, much like we saw in that photo in the previous slide of the blue-banded bees taking refuge and having a bit of a snooze in a local grass. If you're lucky enough and you live near a creek, you may, or an open space, you may get a visitor like a blue-tongued lizard or some marble geckos or a common skink that would also appreciate the grasses, and in particular Dianella, which has big blueberries on it that they really like to eat. They taste absolutely disgusting and can make you give you an upset tummy, so I wouldn't recommend it. You then also want to plant some edibles. There's all sorts of indigenous plants that we love to eat. Common appleberry, native raspberry, which has, in my opinion, has a beautiful flower. You're then also going to want to plant the wildflowers and the understory, which is very important for things like lizards and insects. So they've got a nice little place to crawl around in and be free from predators that may be looking from the sky to possibly whip them up as a snack. You then also may have a whole lot of other visitors. Things like your grey fantail, which loves acacia. Things like your red wattlebird, which some of you may have seen, they're quite successful in urban gardens. The common skink. You've got a little ringtail possum, which would appreciate multiple different places to build a dray, which is their version of a nest. They generally don't nest in a hollow, but will if they're desperate. Got orb spiders. If you are really successful, you may end up getting a predator. So this is a butcher bird. Some of you may have heard them in the morning. They have a beautiful song. They eat things like reptiles. So if you do all of these things, you start getting an ecosystem and it becomes self-sustaining. One supports the other, and we go forth like that. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about an exciting development you have in Banyule, which is that you're allowed to plant your nature strips. This is a really lovely example in Marybeck of a nature strip planting that a colleague of mine has planted. And in my personal opinion, it looks a little bit better than the unevenly mown grass that was previously there. Not only is it providing habitat, it's also helping with that urban heat island effect where all the heat is coming off the road and it has no vegetation to reflect back into. It's managing some of the stormwater runoff, which can sometimes help with flooding and various other things because we're not constantly getting rain, not absorbing into the water table. Plants really help with that. As I said, the neighbourhood aesthetics I think have definitely gone through the roof. It's also a really lovely opportunity to connect with your community and your neighbours. If you're out on the nature strip planting and various other things, you could meet a like-minded person, perhaps a friend. It's also really important for seed dispersal. We've all seen these council drains, and we've probably seen some diagrams or heard some messaging around litter going through it and contaminants, road runoff, pollution that has a horrible environmental effect on our creeks, and that is very true. But if you have a lovely nature strip planting like this, and all of those plants drop their seed, they have a one-way ticket the next time it rains to the local creek, increasing genetic diversity of all of these plants, spreading their seed. It's much nicer than agapanthus and dietes seeds going down the stormwater drain. So I would very much encourage anyone that has the opportunity to plant out their nature strip to do so, and to do it immediately. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about, as our final bit of the presentation, about the tawny frogmouth, which is the mascot animal for Banyule. For anyone that doesn't know, they are not an owl, they are a nightjar, and they're a pretty incredible creature. This tuft of hair right here is very important. They insects fly through this tuft of hair. Very sensitive. They've got lots of nerve endings on the skin there, and when that little tuft of hair is disturbed, it sends a little message that there must be an insect there. The tawny frogmouth then opens its mouth. The roof of its mouth is a yellow colour. The first time that I ever saw it in a rescue situation, I thought, oh, this bird must have an infection. That is very yellow. It is not the case. It is yellow because it is attracting to insects, a moth to the flame yet again. And the tawny frogmouth opens their mouth and the insect flies directly into their mouth. It's a very nice piece of evolution, I believe. So there's a closer look of that lovely, those sensitive hairs that send that signal to the tawny frogmouth that there's something there and I should open my mouth and perhaps dinner will be delivered directly into it. So they really need some taller trees. That's where they prefer to nest. If you've been had the joy to see a tawny frogmouth up in a tree having a snooze looking like a stick, they generally prefer eucalyptus, but they will roost in smaller trees such as acacias and she oaks and things like that. They also need a water source. They probably prefer quite a bigger water source. They're a big bird, particularly in summer where those types of things can be scarce. Now, as we spoke about, they eat moths. So how do we get the moths into the gardens? By those white plants. We need to send those signals to the moths that there's a plant down here that needs to be pollinated. So by planting white plants the moths are going to be attracted to, we're going to create a food source for the tawny frogmouth. They will also eat small lizards. So you can consider, I feel like I'm offering all of these creatures up as sacrificial lambs, but that is the way that the animal kingdom works. They also eat things like lizards, so planting things that the lizards will need, things like the ground cover salt bush with the lovely berries on it, giving them a place to hide, such as these grasses, or maybe even creating a bit of a lizard lounge. Lizards love volcanic rocks and logs and things like that to hide in and sun themselves on, but they also need all of these various plants around them so they can hide. Once we get all those foundations down, we then start thinking of reproduction. So tawny frogmouths make a crap nest. They basically pile a few more sticks in a tree than a pigeon would and then sit on it. So making sure that you don't completely tidy up your garden, leaving some of those sticks and branches around for tawny frogmouths to collect to create a nest is the best way to support them with the building materials that they need to create their little ones a place to hatch and grow up until they're ready to fledge. So that's me. I want to talk about some more resources. I've left the two nearby programs, their symbols in there, depending on where you're from or if you want to tell your friends about it. There's also some other really great resources around. The nurseries are a really important one. They're the places where you're going to get those Indigenous plants. The most expensive thing that you're going to get in there is about $5. It's a bit of a bargain. There's also a whole lot of books that I would recommend as well. There is The Flora of Melbourne, which is if you want to get quite nerdy about your plants. There's also a really great plant called The Plants of the Melbourne's Western Plains. I don't know if George Parrish is here, but I'm going to say it, and he might box my ears later. It's slightly out of EVC, and we're trying to stop talking about ecological vegetation classes because it's all a bit ridiculous and a bit too rigid. So some of the plants that you may be able to get in the nursery may not be there, but I would strongly recommend getting it. It's a great beginner's guide. The most thing that is going to be successful in your garden is birds because of the way that they can move. If you want to learn about them, something like the Compact Australian Bird Guide is a really important one. There's also some lovely books out there about Australian wildlife for children that I would absolutely recommend, that if you have little ones, whether they be your own children or grandchildren or children in your lives, that you go and purchase for Christmas and various other things. There's also a relatively new book called Living with Wildlife by Tanya Luz. She is a wildlife rescuer, very experienced wildlife rescuer, an ecologist who lives in up in the Hepburn Springs, and she's written this really lovely book about supporting wildlife and the do's and don'ts. And I find that it's a really amazing book to gift if you're struggling to get that message through to people that may have some other ideas about how to support wildlife that may not be particularly helpful.